The smell of creosote and hot iron filled her nostrils as consciousness pulled her from a dreamless sleep, and Julia Lancaster opened her eyes to find a stranger crouching beside her with two tin cups, one steaming with coffee and the other filled with water that caught the dawn light like liquid gold. She blinked against the rising sun, her hand instinctively moving to her swollen belly where her unborn child had been shifting restlessly all night, and realized with a start that she had fallen asleep on the hard ground beside the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks, somewhere outside of Hillsborough, New Mexico. "Morning, madam," the stranger said, his voice gentle and unhurried. He wore a dusty brown hat, pulled low over his brow, and beneath it, she could see eyes the color of sage that held both curiosity and concern. "Didn't mean to startle you, but I figured you might need this more than I do." Julia pushed herself up on one elbow, wincing at the stiffness in her back and the ache that seemed to radiate through every bone in her body. She had been walking for 3 days straight, ever since she had fled the boarding house in Silver City, where her late husband's debts had finally caught up to her. The baby was due in 6 weeks, maybe less, and she had nowhere to go except toward her sister's homestead near Socorro, still another 50 miles north along these very tracks. "Thank you," she managed, accepting the coffee with trembling hands. The warmth of the cup seeped into her fingers, and she brought it to her lips, savoring the bitter taste that seemed to anchor her back to the world of the living. "I must look a sight." The cowboy settled back on his heels, studying her with an expression that held no judgment, only a kind of patient watchfulness. "You look like someone who's had a hard road," he said. "Name's Lucas Emmett. I've got a camp just over that ridge, and I was checking my traps when I saw you lying here. At first I thought—" He trailed off, as if reconsidering what he had been about to say. "You thought I was dead," Julia finished for him. She took another sip of coffee and felt strength beginning to return to her limbs. "I don't blame you. I feel half dead most days." Lucas shook his head slowly. "A woman in your condition shouldn't be out here alone. These tracks run through some rough country, and not just because of the terrain. There are men who ride these rails looking for easy targets." Julia knew he was right, but what choice did she have? After Thomas had died in a mining accident 6 months ago, she had discovered that his gambling debts were far greater than anything they had owned. The creditors had taken everything, every stick of furniture, every piece of clothing except what she wore on her back. They would have taken more if she had stayed. "I'm heading to my sister's place," she explained, her free hand still resting protectively on her belly. "It's the only family I have left." Lucas nodded and offered her the second cup. "Drink this too. Water's important in this heat, especially for the baby." He glanced toward the horizon where the sun was climbing steadily, already promising another scorching September day in 1883. "How long since you've eaten?" The question made Julia's stomach clench with hunger. She had finished the last of her cornbread yesterday afternoon, and before that, she had gone nearly a full day on nothing but water from a creek. "I'll manage," she said, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "That wasn't what I asked." Lucas stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the railroad ties. "My camp's got bacon and beans, fresh bread I traded for in Hillsborough yesterday. You should come eat something before you try to go any farther." Pride warred with desperation inside Julia's chest. She had been raised to be self-sufficient, to never accept charity from strangers. But what did pride matter when she could barely stand without her head swimming? What good was independence if she collapsed from hunger and her baby paid the price? "I don't have any money to pay you," she said quietly, meeting his eyes so he would know she was being honest. Lucas extended his hand to help her up. "Didn't ask for any. Come on, it's not far." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet, swaying slightly as blood rushed to her head. Lucas steadied her with a gentle grip on her elbow, waiting until she had found her balance before releasing her. Together, they walked away from the tracks, climbing a gentle slope covered in yellow grass and scattered juniper trees. True to his word, his camp was just over the ridge, a simple setup with a bedroll, a small fire ring with coals still glowing, and saddlebags that looked well worn but carefully maintained. A buckskin horse was tethered nearby, grazing on the sparse vegetation, and it lifted its head to watch them approach with dark, intelligent eyes. Lucas guided Julia to a flat rock near the fire and added a few pieces of dried wood to the coals, coaxing them back to life with practiced ease. "Been working cattle for the Diamond Bar Ranch," he explained as he pulled supplies from his saddlebags. We finished the drive 2 weeks ago, brought a herd up from Texas. I'm heading back to the ranch headquarters near Hillsboro, but I've been taking my time, doing some hunting and trapping along the way. Julia watched as he sliced bacon into a cast iron skillet and set it over the growing flames. The sizzling sound and rich smell made her mouth water so intensely it was almost painful. "You're very kind to help a stranger," she said. Lucas glanced at her over his shoulder, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My mother would haunt me from her grave if I left a pregnant woman beside the railroad tracks without so much as a meal. Besides, it's no trouble. I've got more food than I can eat before it spoils." As the bacon cooked, he opened a cloth bundle and revealed a round loaf of bread that was only slightly stale. He cut thick slices and set them on a flat stone near the fire to warm. From another bag, he produced a tin of beans that he opened and poured into a second pan. The simple act of watching someone prepare food felt like a luxury to Julia, who had spent the last several months scrambling just to survive. "Tell me about your sister," Lucas said as he tended the fire. "What's she like?" Julia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames spread through her chest. "Margaret is 3 years older than me, and she's the strongest person I know. She married a farmer named Robert Hayes, and they've been working a homestead near Socorro for 5 years now. They have 2 little boys, and Margaret wrote to me after Thomas died, saying I could come stay with them for as long as I needed." "That's good," Lucas said, transferring the cooked bacon onto 2 tin plates. "Family's important, especially when times are hard." "Do you have family?" Julia asked, accepting the plate he handed her, along with a fork and a thick slice of bread. Lucas settled onto the ground across from her, his own plate balanced on his knee. "My parents passed when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I've got a younger sister, Sarah, who married a shopkeeper in Santa Fe. We write when we can, but I don't see her much. The cowboy life doesn't leave much time for visiting." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Julia felt life returning to her body with each bite. The bacon was salty and crisp, the beans hearty and filling, and the bread, though not fresh, was still better than anything she had tasted in days. She found herself eating more slowly as her initial hunger was satisfied, savoring the simple pleasure of a hot meal. "How old are you, if you don't mind my asking?" Lucas said after a while. 22, Julia replied. "I'll be 23 in December, and you?" 25 this past spring." He wiped his plate clean with a piece of bread and set it aside. "Young to be widowed and starting over." Julia felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She had cried enough over the past months, and tears wouldn't change anything. Thomas was a good man, but he had demons he couldn't shake. The gambling was his way of trying to feel in control, I think. The mine work was hard and dangerous, and every day he went down into the earth not knowing if he'd come back up. I think he needed something that made him feel like he had power over his own fate. "Even if it meant losing everything," Lucas said softly. "Even then." Julia set her empty plate down and wrapped her arms around herself despite the growing heat of the day. "I was angry at him for a long time after he died. Angry that he left me with nothing, that he put his need for that false sense of control above our future, above the baby. But anger doesn't pay debts or put food on the table, so I had to let it go." Lucas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Letting go of anger is harder than holding on to it sometimes. Sounds like you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Something in his tone made Julia look up and really see him for the first time. He had a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors, with sun lines at the corners of his eyes and a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. But there was a gentleness in his expression that seemed at odds with the rugged cowboy exterior, a softness that suggested he understood loss and hardship firsthand. "What were you really doing out here?" she asked. "You said you were checking traps, but most trappers don't camp this close to the railroad." A sheepish look crossed Lucas's face. "Truth is, I like the sound of the trains. I know that probably sounds foolish, but there's something about hearing that whistle in the distance, knowing that people are going places, seeing new things, makes the world feel bigger somehow." Julia found herself smiling for the first time, in longer than she could remember. "That doesn't sound foolish at all. When I was a girl, my father used to take Margaret and me to watch the trains pass through our town in Kansas. He'd make up stories about where the passengers were going and what adventures they were having. I loved those afternoons." "Kansas," Lucas repeated, "long way from New Mexico." "We came west after our parents died. Margaret met Robert at a church social in Albuquerque, and I met Thomas working at a hotel in Silver City. I thought we'd build a life there, but nothing ever turns out the way you plan, does it?" Lucas shook his head. "No, it surely doesn't. But sometimes what you end up with is better than what you planned. Not always, but sometimes." They talked for another hour as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot. Lucas told her about his work on the cattle drives, about sleeping under the stars and riding for days across open country. He spoke of the ranch where he worked, of the owner who was fair but demanding, of the other cowboys who had become like brothers to him over the years. Julia found herself relaxing in his presence, the constant tension that had gripped her for months slowly unwinding. Eventually, Lucas stood and began packing up his camp with efficient movements. "I'm going to offer you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer," he said, rolling up his bedroll and tying it with practice loops. "Hillsboro's only about 10 miles south of here. There's a doctor there, Dr. Samuel Morrison, and his wife runs a boarding house that's clean and respectable. I think you should come back with me and stay there for a few days, rest up, and let the doctor check on you and the baby. After that, if you still want to go to your sister's place, I'll take you there myself." Julia's first instinct was to refuse. She had already accepted too much from this stranger, and she couldn't afford to owe anyone anything. But before she could speak, the baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if adding its own opinion to the conversation. She winced and pressed her hand to the spot, feeling the small body shifting inside her. "I can't ask you to do that," she said. "You've already done so much." Lucas secured his saddlebags to his horse and turned to face her. "You're not asking. I'm offering. And before you start talking about charity and pride, let me tell you something. My mother died giving birth to my sister because there was no doctor nearby and my father didn't know how to help her. I was only 10 years old, but I remember every detail of that night. I swore then that if I ever had the chance to help a woman in your situation, I'd do it. No questions asked and no payment expected. So this isn't about you owing me anything. This is about me keeping a promise I made to myself 15 years ago." The raw honesty in his voice left Julia speechless. She looked into his sage-colored eyes and saw only sincerity, no hidden motives or expectations. The baby kicked again, gentler this time, and she made her decision. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you to Hillsboro." Lucas's face lit up with a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "Good. That's real good. Can you ride, or would you rather walk? It's about 3 hours either way." Julia glanced at the buckskin horse, which was watching them with placid interest. "I can ride if the horse doesn't mind carrying extra weight. Copper's carried heavier loads than you and never complained." Lucas approached the horse and stroked its neck affectionately. "He's steady and gentle. You'll be safe with him." Getting into the saddle proved more challenging than Julia had anticipated with her swollen belly, but Lucas helped her up with patient hands, making sure she was secure before he took Copper's reins and began leading them south. He walked beside the horse with an easy ground-eating stride that spoke of years spent on foot across rough country. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way. All golden grass and red rocks beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Juniper and piñon trees dotted the hillsides, and in the distance, mountains rose like ancient sentinels, keeping watch over the high desert. Julia had grown to love New Mexico during her years here, the way the light changed throughout the day, turning the land from gold to amber to deep purple as the sun moved across the sky. "Tell me about the boarding house," she said, as Copper picked his way carefully along a narrow trail. "Mrs. Morrison's place is the best in town," Lucas replied. "She's a kind woman, real motherly type. She and the doctor never had children of their own, so she tends to fuss over anyone who stays there. The rooms are clean, the food is good, and she doesn't tolerate any nonsense from the guests. You'll be safe there. And the doctor? He's been practicing in Hillsboro for near 20 years, came out from Boston after the war, looking for a fresh start. He's getting on in years now, must be close to 60, but his hands are steady and his mind is sharp. If there's anyone who can make sure you and the baby are healthy, it's him." They walked for a while in silence, and Julia found herself studying Lucas's profile, the straight line of his nose and the determined set of his jaw. He moved with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was nothing arrogant about him. Every so often he would glance back at her to make sure she was managing all right, his eyes warm with concern. "Why aren't you married?" The question slipped out before Julia could stop it, and she immediately felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, that was too personal." Lucas chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to roll across the desert like distant thunder. "It's all right, I don't mind. Truth is, I never found anyone who could tolerate the cowboy life. Most women want a man who comes home every night, who doesn't spend months at a time on the trail. Can't say I blame them. It's a hard life, and it's lonely more often than not." "You could find other work," Julia suggested. "I could," Lucas agreed. "But I love what I do. I love the freedom of it, the challenge, the way every day is different. I've thought about settling down, buying a small ranch of my own someday, but that takes money I don't have yet. Been saving for years, but cattle work doesn't pay much, and there's always something that comes up that needs those savings more." Julia understood that all too well. She and Thomas had been saving for their own place too, dreaming of a little house with a garden and room for children to run. Those dreams had died with him in the dark tunnels beneath Silver City. The sun was nearly overhead when they stopped beside a creek to water the horse and rest. Lucas helped Julia down from the saddle, and she walked stiffly to the water's edge, kneeling carefully to splash the cool liquid on her face and neck. The relief was immediate and wonderful. "We're making good time," Lucas said, crouching beside her to fill his canteen. "Should reach Hillsboro by early afternoon if we keep this pace." "I appreciate you walking," Julia said. "I know it would be faster if you rode." Lucas shook his head. "Speed isn't everything. Besides, Copper doesn't mind the walk, and neither do I." They shared some dried beef and hard biscuits from Lucas's supplies, washing it down with cold creek water. Julia felt the baby moving again, a rolling sensation that was becoming more frequent as her due date approached. She wondered what Thomas would have thought about becoming a father, whether it might have changed him, given him a reason to stop gambling and start building a real future. She would never know now. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle. Julia realized she had been staring into the distance, lost in her thoughts. "Just wondering what kind of life this baby will have, whether I can give them what they need." "You'll figure it out," Lucas said with quiet confidence. "Anyone strong enough to survive what you've been through is strong enough to be a mother." His faith in her felt like a gift, and Julia found herself blinking back tears again. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Lucas said. "I know you didn't give up when you lost everything. I know you're walking 50 miles pregnant to reach your family, rather than beg or steal. I know you care more about your baby than your own pride. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." They continued their journey as the afternoon heat intensified, and Julia was grateful for the hat Lucas insisted she wear to protect her face from the merciless sun. He walked tirelessly beside Copper, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about his travels. He had a gift for storytelling, painting vivid pictures with his words, and Julia found herself transported to the places he described, forgetting for brief moments the ache in her body and the uncertainty of her future. Hillsboro appeared gradually on the horizon, first as a shimmer in the heat, then as distinct buildings clustered in a valley between low hills. It was larger than Julia had expected, with a proper main street lined with wooden structures and false-fronted shops. The sound of activity reached them as they approached, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, voices calling to one another, the creak of wagon wheels on packed dirt. Lucas led them straight to a 2-story house on a quiet side street, painted white with green shutters and a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Flowers grew in neat beds along the foundation, bright spots of color in the dusty landscape. A sign hanging from the porch rail read, "Morrison Boarding House," in neat black letters. "Wait here," Lucas said, helping Julia down from the horse. He bounded up the porch steps and knocked on the door, which opened almost immediately to reveal a plump woman in her 50s with gray-streaked brown hair and a kind face that creased into a smile when she saw him. "Lucas Emmett, as I live and breathe," she exclaimed. "I thought you were still out on the range." "Just got back, Mrs. Morrison," Lucas said, "but I'm not here for a room. I found a woman who needs help, and I'm hoping you and the doctor might take her in for a while." Mrs. Morrison's eyes moved past Lucas to where Julia stood beside Copper, and her expression immediately shifted from friendly to concerned. She hurried down the steps with surprising speed for her size, taking in Julia's condition and disheveled appearance in one comprehensive glance. "Oh, my dear," she breathed. "Come inside at once. You look ready to drop." Within minutes, Julia found herself being ushered into a cool parlor and settled into a comfortable chair, while Mrs. Morrison bustled about, calling for her husband and instructing someone Julia couldn't see to bring water and towels. Lucas stood near the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching to make sure Julia was being cared for before he left. Dr. Morrison appeared, a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and gentle hands that quickly assessed Julia's condition. He asked questions in a calm, professional voice while his wife hovered nearby, and Julia answered as best she could, explaining about Thomas's death and her journey towards Socorro. "Well, young lady," the doctor said when he had finished his examination, "you and the baby seem healthy considering what you've been through, but you need rest and regular meals. I'd like you to stay here for at least a week, maybe 2, until you've regained your strength. After that, we can discuss the best way to get you to your sister's place." "I don't have money to pay you," Julia said, the now familiar words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Mrs. Morrison waved her hand dismissively. "We'll work something out, dear. Perhaps you can help around the house once you're feeling better. I can always use an extra pair of hands with the cooking and cleaning. Now, let's get you upstairs to a room where you can rest properly." Lucas caught Julia's eye before she left the parlor, and the relief on his face was obvious. "I'll come check on you tomorrow," he said. "Make sure you're settling in all right." "Thank you," Julia said, putting as much feeling as she could into those 2 simple words. "For everything." Lucas smiled and placed his hat back on his head. "Get some rest, Julia. You've earned it." The room Mrs. Morrison led her to was small but immaculately clean, with a real bed covered in a wedding ring quilt and curtains that filtered the afternoon light into something soft and golden. Julia sank onto the mattress with a sigh of pure relief, feeling muscles she hadn't known were tense finally relaxing. Mrs. Morrison brought her a basin of warm water and a clean nightgown, helping her wash and change before tucking her into bed like a child. "Sleep now," the older woman said, smoothing the hair back from Julia's forehead. "Everything else can wait until you've rested." Julia closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under. Her last conscious thought, a prayer of gratitude for railroad tracks and cowboys who made coffee for strangers. She woke to darkness and the sound of rain pattering against the window. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, panic rising in her chest until memory returned and she remembered the boarding house, Dr. Morrison's examination, the soft bed beneath her. She sat up slowly, her body stiff but less painful than it had been in weeks. A lamp burned low on the bedside table, and beside it sat a tray with a covered bowl that was still warm to the touch. Julia lifted the cover to find chicken soup thick with vegetables and noodles, along with fresh bread and butter and a glass of milk. Her stomach rumbled with hunger, and she ate every bite, savoring the rich flavors and the knowledge that this meal had been prepared with care and kindness. When she finished eating, she rose and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-swept street below. Hillsborough was quiet at this hour, most of its citizens already asleep in their beds. She thought about Lucas, wondering where he was sleeping tonight, whether he had found lodging, or if he was camped somewhere under the stars despite the weather. The baby shifted inside her, a gentle reminder of why she was here and what still lay ahead. She rested her hand on her belly and whispered, "We're going to be all right. I promise you, we're going to figure this out." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the rain having washed the dust from the air and left everything smelling fresh and clean. Julia woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of activity from downstairs. She dressed in her own clothes, which someone had washed and mended while she slept, and made her way down to the dining room, where several other boarders were already eating breakfast. Mrs. Morrison greeted her with a warm smile and a plate piled high with eggs, bacon, and fried potatoes. "You look much better this morning, dear. The doctor wants to examine you again later, but for now, just eat and take things easy." Julia had just finished her breakfast when there was a knock at the front door. Mrs. Morrison answered it, and Julia heard Lucas's voice in the hallway, asking after her. Her heart gave an unexpected leap, and she found herself smoothing her hair and checking her appearance before he entered the dining room. He looked different in town clothes, a clean shirt and pressed trousers instead of trail-worn gear. His hair damp as if he had just bathed. He held his hat in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers in the other, their purple and yellow blooms bright against his weathered fingers. "Morning," he said, his eyes meeting hers with unmistakable warmth. "Thought you might like these. Found them growing near the creek on the edge of town. Julia accepted the flowers with hands that trembled slightly. "They're beautiful. Thank you." "How are you feeling?" Lucas asked, taking a seat across from her at Mrs. Morrison's invitation. "Much better. A real bed and regular meals work wonders." Julia arranged the flowers in a water glass Mrs. Morrison provided, touched by the simple gesture. "How about you? Where did you end up staying?" "Got a room at the hotel down the street. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and quiet." Lucas accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Morrison and wrapped his hands around it. "I talked to the ranch foreman this morning, told him I'd be in town for a while yet, helping a friend. He understood." "Lucas, you don't have to stay on my account," Julia protested. "You've already done so much." Lucas met her eyes steadily. "I want to stay, at least until we know you and the baby are healthy and you're ready to travel to your sister's place. After that, well, we can figure things out as we go." Something in his tone made Julia's pulse quicken. She looked at this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to voice, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with the way Lucas looked at her, as if she was someone worth caring about. The days that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Julia helped Mrs. Morrison with light tasks around the boarding house, setting tables and folding laundry and helping prepare meals. The work was easy and satisfying, giving her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Dr. Morrison examined her regularly and pronounced both her and the baby healthy and thriving. Lucas came to visit every day, sometimes in the morning and sometimes in the evening, always with some small gift or interesting story to share. He brought her books from the town library, fresh fruit from the general store, a shawl one of the ranch wives had knitted when she heard about Julia's situation. They would sit on the porch or in the parlor and talk for hours, discovering shared interests and values, learning each other's histories and dreams. Julia learned that Lucas loved poetry despite his rough exterior, that he played the harmonica around campfires and knew dozens of songs by heart. He told her about his dreams of owning a ranch someday, of raising horses instead of just working other people's cattle. He spoke of his sister Sarah with deep affection and his parents with lingering grief, and Julia found herself sharing things she had never told anyone about her complicated feelings toward Thomas, her fears about motherhood, her hopes for the future. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after Lucas had first found her beside the railroad tracks, they sat on the porch swing watching the sun set behind the hills. The air was cooling rapidly as it always did in the high desert, and Lucas had draped his jacket around Julia's shoulders without her needing to ask. "I've been thinking," Lucas said, his voice quiet in the gathering dusk, "about what happens next." Julia felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had been dreading this conversation, knowing it had to come, but wishing she could postpone it forever. "You need to get back to the ranch, I understand." "That's not what I was going to say." Lucas turned to face her, and in the fading light, his eyes were serious and intent. "I've been thinking that maybe you shouldn't go to your sister's place, at least not permanently." Julia's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" Lucas took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "I mean that I've grown to care about you, Julia, more than I probably should have in such a short time. I know your husband hasn't been gone that long, and I know you're carrying his child, but I can't help how I feel. These past 2 weeks have been the best I've had in longer than I can remember, and the thought of you leaving, of not seeing you every day, it doesn't sit right with me." Julia couldn't breathe. She stared at Lucas, seeing the vulnerability in his expression, the hope and fear warring in his eyes, and she realized that she felt the same way. Somewhere between the railroad tracks and this porch swing, between his gift of coffee and these quiet evening conversations, she had fallen in love with this gentle cowboy who had given her back her life. "I care about you too," she whispered. "But Lucas, I'm pregnant with another man's child. I have nothing to offer you except complications and responsibilities that aren't yours. You deserve someone who can give you a fresh start, not someone with all this baggage." Lucas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm and strong around hers. "You listen to me, Julia Lancaster. I'm not looking for a fresh start with someone else. I'm looking for a life with you. That baby you're carrying deserves a father who will love them and protect them, and I want to be that man. I know it's fast, and I know people will talk, but I don't care about any of that. I care about you." Tears spilled down Julia's cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than grief or fear. Are you sure? Really sure? Because once the baby comes, once you take on that responsibility, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Lucas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Marry me, Julia. Let me take care of you and the baby. Let me show you what it's like to have a partner who puts you first. Julia couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she nodded instead, and Lucas's face broke into the most beautiful smile she had ever seen. He pulled her into his arms, careful of her swollen belly, and held her while she cried against his shoulder, releasing months of accumulated fear and loneliness and grief. "We'll do it right," Lucas murmured into her hair. "I've got some money saved, not much, but enough to rent a house here in town until after the baby comes. After that, we'll figure out the rest together. Maybe I'll hire on with one of the local ranches so I can come home every night. Maybe we'll find another way, but whatever we do, we'll do it as a family." They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Hillsborough. It was a simple ceremony held in the boarding house parlor, with Dr. and Mrs. Morrison standing as witnesses and a few of the other boarders in attendance. Julia wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Morrison had altered to fit over her belly, and Lucas wore his Sunday best with his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her with a tenderness that made Julia's knees weak, and she knew without a doubt that she had made the right choice. This was nothing like her first marriage, which had been born of loneliness and convenience. This was real love, the kind that came from truly knowing another person and choosing them anyway. Lucas had found them a small house on the edge of town, just 2 rooms and a kitchen. But it had a solid roof and a well in the yard, and windows that let in plenty of light. They spent the next few weeks making it into a home, Lucas building furniture in the evenings, while Julia sewed curtains and arranged their few possessions. The ranch foreman, true to his word, had given Lucas work at a nearby spread that didn't require long absences, and though the pay was modest, it was enough for their needs. Julia wrote to her sister Margaret, explaining everything that had happened and introducing Lucas through the inadequate medium of words on paper. Margaret's response came 3 weeks later, full of relief and joy and insistence that they visit as soon as the baby was old enough to travel. She also sent a package of baby clothes and blankets, along with a note that said, "I'm so glad you found someone who will take care of you the way you deserve. Thomas was my friend, but he never quite grew up. This Lucas sounds like a real man." The baby came on a cold November night, 6 weeks after the wedding. Julia's labor lasted 12 hours, with Dr. Morrison in attendance and Mrs. Morrison holding her hand through the worst of the contractions. Lucas paced in the front room, wearing a path in the floorboards until the doctor finally called him in to meet his new son. The baby was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue-gray as Julia's. He had strong lungs and a healthy appetite, and when Lucas held him for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks, Julia fell in love with her husband all over again. "What should we name him?" Lucas asked, his voice thick with emotion. Julia had been thinking about this for weeks. "I want to call him Thomas, after his father, but give him your last name, Thomas Emmett. That way he'll carry a piece of where he came from, but everyone will know he's your son in every way that matters." Lucas looked at her with such love and gratitude that Julia's heart felt too big for her chest. "Thomas Emmett," he repeated softly. "It's perfect." The months that followed were the happiest of Julia's life. She discovered that Lucas was a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby even in the middle of the night when Thomas woke crying. He would walk the floor with his son tucked against his shoulder, singing old cowboy songs in his rumbling voice until the baby drifted back to sleep. Julia healed from the birth and found strength returning to her body. She and Lucas fell into the rhythms of married life, learning each other's quirks and habits, building the kind of partnership she had always dreamed of. They talked about everything, their conversations ranging from the mundane details of daily life to deep philosophical questions about the nature of love and happiness. In the spring, when Thomas was 5 months old, they made the journey to Socorro to visit Margaret and her family. The reunion was joyful and tearful, with Margaret exclaiming over the baby and pulling Julia aside to whisper how happy she looked, how different from the scared, grieving widow who had written to her months ago. Lucas got along famously with Robert, the 2 men bonding over shared farming and ranching knowledge, and Margaret's boys adored their new uncle, following him around the homestead and begging for stories about cowboys and cattle drives. They spent a week at the farm, helping with the spring planting and letting Thomas get to know his cousins. On their last evening there, as they all sat around the dinner table, Margaret raised her glass in a toast. "To family," she said, her eyes shining, "both the one we're born into and the one we choose. Julia, I'm so glad you found your way to Lucas, and Lucas, we're honored to call you brother." They drank to that, and Julia felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had lost so much, survived such hardship, but here on the other side of that darkness was a life richer than anything she could have imagined. She had a husband who loved her unconditionally, a healthy son, family who cared about her, and a future that stretched out bright with possibility. The years passed in a blur of seasons and growing. Thomas took his first steps, spoke his first words, grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler. Lucas proved to be as good as his word, working hard and saving every spare penny toward his dream of owning their own ranch. Julia discovered she had a talent for raising chickens, and her egg business brought in extra money that she added to their savings. When Thomas was 2 years old, Julia discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy was easier this time, without the shadow of grief and uncertainty that had haunted her first time, and Lucas was beside himself with joy. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving animals into the headboard with painstaking care. Their daughter was born in the summer, a tiny thing with Lucas's sage-colored eyes and a temperament as sunny as the season of her birth. They named her Rose, and Thomas was enchanted with his baby sister, constantly wanting to hold her and help care for her. By the time Thomas was 5 and Rose was 3, Lucas had saved enough money to make a down payment on a small ranch about 10 miles outside of Hillsboro. It wasn't much, just 160 acres with a modest house and a barn that needed repairs, but it was theirs. Julia cried when she saw the deed with their names on it, overwhelmed by the knowledge that they had built this through hard work and sacrifice and unwavering commitment to each other. They moved to the ranch in the spring, and Lucas threw himself into the work of building it into a real operation. He started with horses, buying a few good mares and a promising young stallion, breeding and training them for sale. Julia expanded her chicken operation and started a garden that soon became the talk of the county, producing vegetables even in the harsh desert climate. The children thrived in the open space, learning to ride almost before they could walk properly, helping with chores appropriate to their ages, growing brown and strong under the New Mexico sun. Thomas showed an early aptitude for working with the horses, and Rose had her mother's green thumb, spending hours in the garden talking to the plants as if they could understand her. Life on the ranch was hard but deeply satisfying. There were challenges, of course, droughts that tested their water resources, harsh winters that required careful planning and preparation, the constant worry about money and markets and weather. But through it all, Julia and Lucas faced everything together, their love deepening with each obstacle they overcame. One evening, when they had been married for 7 years, Julia and Lucas sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The children were asleep inside, exhausted from a day of helping with the horse training, and the house was peaceful and quiet. "Do you ever think about that day by the railroad tracks?" Lucas asked, reaching over to take Julia's hand. Julia smiled, squeezing his fingers gently. "All the time. It feels like a lifetime ago. But I can still remember exactly how I felt when I opened my eyes and saw you there with that coffee. Like, maybe God hadn't forgotten about me after all." "I think about it too," Lucas said, "about how close I came to riding right past without seeing you. If I had camped even a quarter mile in either direction, if I had woken up an hour later, if any one of 100 small things had been different, we might never have met." "But we did meet," Julia said. "And everything that's happened since, all of this, it's because you stopped to help a stranger when you didn't have to. You gave me back my life, Lucas. You gave Thomas a father and Rose a chance to exist at all. You gave me a love I didn't even know was possible." Lucas turned to face her fully, and in the fading light, she could see the emotion shining in his eyes. "You gave me just as much, Julia. Before I found you, I was just drifting, going through the motions of life without any real purpose or direction. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting. You and the children, you're everything I never knew I needed." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 7 years of shared history and the promise of all the years yet to come. When they finally pulled apart, Julia rested her head on Lucas's shoulder and looked out at the land they had built together, the barn and corrals, the garden and chicken coops, the horses grazing peacefully in the pasture. "We should probably think about adding on to the house soon," Lucas said thoughtfully. "The children are getting bigger, and they'll need their own rooms before too long." Julia laughed softly. "Always planning ahead. That's one of the things I love most about you. Someone has to balance out your tendency to dive headfirst into things without thinking them through," Lucas teased, and Julia elbowed him gently in the ribs. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. The soft nickering of horses, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of wind through the grass. This was home in every sense of the word, not just a place, but a feeling of belonging and safety and love. Over the next few years, the ranch continued to prosper. Lucas's horses gained a reputation for quality and temperament, and buyers came from as far away as Texas and Arizona to purchase his stock. Julia's garden and chickens provided steady income, and she started teaching other ranch wives her techniques for growing vegetables in the challenging climate. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, hard-working boy who had inherited his mother's determination and his father's patience. He had no memory of the man whose name he carried, and Lucas was the only father he had ever known. Julia told him the truth about his birth father when he was old enough to understand, wanting him to know his full history. But Thomas just shrugged and said, "Lucas is my pa, that's all that matters to me." Rose was spirited and creative, always coming up with elaborate games and stories to entertain her brother. She loved helping her mother in the garden and the kitchen, but she also loved riding with her father, and Lucas made sure she knew that girls could do anything boys could do if they worked hard enough. When Thomas was 10 and Rose was 8, Julia gave birth to twin boys, Samuel and Benjamin. Lucas was 40 years old by then, and Julia was 32, and they had thought their family was complete, so the twins were a joyous surprise. Thomas and Rose were old enough to be real helpers, and the whole family pitched in to care for the babies. The ranch house got its addition, 3 new bedrooms and a proper dining room where they could all gather for meals. Lucas hired a ranch hand to help with the increased workload, a young man fresh from Kansas who reminded Julia of herself when she had first come west, full of hope and looking for a fresh start. Margaret and her family visited every summer, and the cousins became close despite the distance between them. Robert and Lucas talked about possibly going into business together, breeding horses on Robert's land and training them on Lucas's, a partnership that would benefit both families. As the years continued to pass, Julia watched her children grow and her husband age gracefully into middle age, his dark hair showing threads of silver at the temples, his face gaining more character lines, but his eyes remaining as warm and loving as they had been that first morning by the railroad tracks. When Thomas was 16, he asked if he could help more with the training operation, and Lucas began teaching him everything he knew about working with horses. Rose, at 14, announced that she wanted to go to the new teachers' college in Santa Fe, and though it broke Julia's heart a little to think of her daughter leaving, she was proud of her ambition and determination. The twins, now 6 years old, were absolute terrors in the best possible way, always getting into mischief, but impossible to stay angry at for long. They worshipped their older siblings and followed them around constantly, asking endless questions about everything. One autumn evening, when the cottonwoods had turned gold and the air carried the first hints of winter, Julia and Lucas celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. The children had planned a surprise party, inviting neighbors and friends from town, and the ranch house was filled with laughter and music and dancing. Dr. and Mrs. Morrison came, both of them white-haired now, but still spry and active. They had long since retired from running the boarding house, but they remained close friends with Julia and Lucas, unofficial grandparents to the children who called them aunt and uncle. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Julia and Lucas found themselves alone on the porch once more, their favorite place to sit and talk and simply be together. Lucas pulled her close, and she leaned into his solid warmth, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and hay and the bay rum soap he used. 20 years, Lucas murmured into her hair. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like you've always been part of my life. I know what you mean, Julia said. I can barely remember what life was like before you, and I don't want to. These 20 years with you have been the best of my life. Lucas pulled back slightly so he could look into her eyes. You know what I'm most grateful for? that I followed my instinct that morning to check the railroad tracks, that I didn't just assume you were a bundle of rags or a drunk sleeping it off, that I took the time to make that coffee and offer it to a stranger. Julia reached up to cup his weathered cheek. And I'm grateful that I had the courage to accept your help, to trust you when I had no reason to trust anyone. You saved my life that day, Lucas Emmett, but you did so much more than that. You showed me what real love looks like, what a real partnership can be. You loved my son as your own from the moment he was born. You've given me a life beyond anything I could have imagined. They kissed then, a kiss that held 2 decades of love and commitment, of challenges overcome and joys shared, of a family built on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering devotion. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears in their eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that come from hearts too full to contain all the emotion inside. The years continued their steady march forward. Rose did go to teacher's college, graduating at the top of her class and returning to teach in the one-room schoolhouse near Hillsboro. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as Lucas's back began to trouble him from decades of hard physical labor. The twins grew into gangly adolescents with their father's height and their mother's quick wit. When Julia was 45 and Lucas was 53, they became grandparents for the first time. Thomas married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a sweet-natured young woman named Emily, who fit seamlessly into the family. Their first child, a daughter they named Julia, after her grandmother, was born on a spring morning so beautiful it seemed to promise nothing but good things ahead. Lucas cried when he held his granddaughter for the first time, and Julia understood completely because she had cried too. There was something profound about seeing your child become a parent, about holding a new generation, and knowing that the love you had built would extend far beyond your own lifetime. Rose married a few years later, choosing a fellow teacher who shared her passion for education and her independent spirit. They settled in Santa Fe, and though Julia missed having her daughter close by, she was proud of the life Rose was building for herself. The twins, now young men of 18, were both courting girls from town, and Julia suspected it wouldn't be long before there were more weddings and more grandchildren. The thought filled her with joy, tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that time was passing, that the active years of raising children were behind her, that she and Lucas were entering a new phase of life. But it was a good phase, she thought, sitting on the porch one evening, with Lucas beside her and their granddaughter sleeping in a cradle nearby, while Thomas and Emily worked in the barn. They had built something that would last, a family and a home and a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, and Julia realized she had been smiling. "Everything," she said simply. "All of it. The whole strange, beautiful journey from those railroad tracks to this porch. All the years in between. All the love." Lucas wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" "The best journey," Julia agreed. "And you know what the most amazing thing is? I think the best is still ahead. Watching our grandchildren grow up, seeing what lives our children build, maybe even meeting great-grandchildren someday, if we're lucky enough to live that long." "I plan to stick around for a good while yet," Lucas said with mock seriousness. "I've got to make sure those grandbabies know how to ride and rope properly." Julia laughed and kissed his cheek. "I love you, Lucas Emmett. I've loved you from the moment you woke me up with coffee and called me by my name before you even knew it." "I love you too, Julia Emmett. I've loved you from the moment I saw you lying there beside those tracks and knew that my life was about to change forever. And I was right. You changed everything, and I've been grateful for it every single day since." They sat together as the sun set over their ranch, over the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work and a chance encounter beside railroad tracks. The evening breeze carried the scent of horses and hay, of Julia's garden in full bloom, of home in every sense of the word. Inside the house, Julia could hear the sounds of family, Thomas's deep voice answering something Emily had asked, the baby starting to fuss and then settling again, the familiar creaks and sighs of a house full of life and love. This was what she had been walking toward all those years ago, when she had fallen asleep exhausted and heartbroken beside the Southern Pacific line. She just hadn't known it yet. The years continued to pass in the way they always do, with seasons changing and children growing, and the steady accumulation of small moments that add up to a life well lived. Lucas's hair went completely silver, and Julia's face showed the lines of 50 years lived under the harsh western sun. But their love never diminished, never grew old or stale or ordinary. They celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by children and grandchildren, the ranch house bursting at the seams with family who had come from near and far to honor the couple at the center of it all. Someone proposed a toast to the unlikely beginning of their marriage, and Lucas stood and raised his glass, his voice still strong despite his years. "To railroad tracks and coffee," he said, his eyes finding Julia's across the crowded room. "To second chances and new beginnings. To the woman who taught me what it means to truly love someone. To my wife, my partner, my best friend, to Julia." Everyone drank to that, but Julia only had eyes for Lucas, for the man who had given her everything when she had nothing, who had loved her son as his own, who had built a life with her that exceeded her wildest dreams. She crossed the room and took his hand, and together they stepped out onto the porch where their story had really begun all those years ago. 30 years, Julia said, looking out at the ranch that was now being run primarily by Thomas and his family, at the land they had worked and loved and passed on to the next generation. If someone had told me that morning beside the tracks that 30 years later I'd be standing here with you, surrounded by our family on our own ranch, I would have thought they were crazy. "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never see coming," Lucas said, pulling her close. "I certainly never expected to find the love of my life lying beside railroad tracks in the middle of nowhere, but I did, and it's been the greatest adventure of my life." They stood together watching the stars come out, the same stars that had watched over them that first night when Julia had slept on the hard ground and Lucas had camped nearby, not yet knowing how their lives would intertwine. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Inside, their family laughed and celebrated, but out here in the peaceful darkness, it was just the two of them, the way it had been that first morning when everything changed. Julia rested her head on Lucas's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had become more precious to her than any music. "Thank you," she whispered, "for the coffee, for the name, for everything that came after. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible, for helping me when I had nothing to offer in return, for loving me when I didn't think I could be loved again." Lucas tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for trusting me, for taking a chance on a cowboy with nothing but good intentions and a dream. Thank you for making me a father and a grandfather, for building this life with me, for 30 years of love that just keeps getting better." They stayed there until the party inside began to wind down, until their children came looking for them to say goodnight and thank them for the celebration. They stayed until the last guest had gone home, and the house was quiet except for the soft sounds of grandchildren sleeping in borrowed beds throughout the rooms. As they climbed the stairs to their own bedroom, the room they had shared for 3 decades, Lucas took Julia's hand and pulled her close for one more kiss. It was a kiss that held everything words couldn't express, all the gratitude and love and commitment that had sustained them through the years. "Here's to the next 30 years, Lucas murmured against her lips. Julia smiled and kissed him again. "Here's to forever." And in that moment, standing in the house they had built on the ranch they had created, surrounded by the evidence of a love that had started beside railroad tracks with a cup of coffee and a kind word, Julia knew that forever was exactly what they would have. Not in some abstract afterlife, but here in the legacy they had created, in the children and grandchildren who carried their love forward into the future, in the story that would be told and retold about the pregnant woman who slept beside train tracks until a cowboy woke her with coffee and gave her not just a name, but a whole new life. The years that followed brought both joys and sorrows, as all lives must. They lost Dr. Morrison first, his gentle presence missed by everyone who had known him, followed a year later by his devoted wife, who seemed unable to live without her partner of 50 years. Julia and Lucas attended their funerals with heavy hearts, remembering how much those two people had meant to them in the early days of their marriage. But there were joys too, so many joys. More grandchildren were born, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices and laughter. The twins both married and settled nearby, one taking over a section of the ranch, and the other opening a feed store in Hillsboro that became the gathering place for ranchers throughout the region. Rose had 3 children who would visit every summer, city kids who were transformed by weeks spent on the ranch, learning to ride and work and appreciate the land. Thomas and Emily had 4 children in total, and their oldest daughter, Julia, grew up to be a physician, the first woman doctor many in the region had ever seen. Lucas's sister Sarah came to visit when they celebrated their 40th anniversary, and it was a bittersweet reunion because they could both see how time had marked the other. But Sarah and Julia became fast friends, and Sarah confessed that she had prayed for years that her brother would find the love he deserved, and her prayers had been answered beyond anything she could have imagined. As they entered their 60s, Lucas and Julia gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Thomas and his family, but they never fully retired. Lucas still went out to check on the horses most days, moving more slowly, but with the same careful attention he had always shown. Julia still tended her garden, though now with the help of grandchildren who had inherited her green thumb. They took a trip back to Kansas one summer, wanting to see the places where they had grown up before it was too late. They found Julia's childhood home still standing, though much changed, and spent an afternoon walking the streets of her old town, remembering. They visited the cemetery where her parents were buried, and Julia placed flowers on their graves and told them about the life she had built, hoping somehow they knew and were proud. On the way back to New Mexico, they made a deliberate stop beside a section of the Southern Pacific Railroad line, not the exact spot where they had first met, but close enough. They stood there holding hands as a train thundered past, and Julia thought about the desperate, frightened woman she had been all those years ago, sleeping on the ground, with nowhere to go, and nothing to hope for. If I could go back and tell her what was waiting for her, Julia said, tears streaming down her face. If I could tell that woman that in just a few hours her whole life was going to change, that she was going to find love and family and a home that would last a lifetime, I don't think she would believe me. Lucas wrapped her in his arms, his own eyes wet with emotion. But it all came true anyway, every bit of it. Because of you, Julia said fiercely. Because you stopped when you could have ridden past. Because you made coffee for a stranger. Because you saw someone who needed help and you helped her without expecting anything in return. I got everything in return, Lucas said softly. I got you. They returned to the ranch renewed and grateful, holding even more tightly to the precious time they had left. They attended church socials and community gatherings, watching the area they had lived in for so long continue to grow and change. The railroad that had brought them together was now just one of many that crisscrossed the territory, and automobiles were becoming more common, though Lucas declared he would never trust anything that didn't have 4 legs and a personality. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered once more, 3 generations of Emmets filling the ranch house and spilling out onto the grounds. Someone had arranged for a photographer to come from Albuquerque, and they took pictures of the whole family, dozens of people all connected by the love of 2 people who had met beside railroad tracks. In the formal portrait, Lucas and Julia sat in the center, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. Lucas's hand rested on Julia's shoulder, and she covered it with her own, their fingers intertwined in a gesture so familiar it was unconscious. They were both in their 70s now, their faces lined with age and experience, but their eyes held the same warmth and love they had shared since that first morning. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and most of the family had retired to various rooms and borrowed beds, Julia and Lucas sat on their porch one last time. They had repeated this ritual thousands of times over the decades, but tonight it felt especially precious, weighted with meaning neither of them wanted to name aloud. 50 years, Julia said, the wonder still evident in her voice. Half a century of loving you. Best 50 years of my life, Lucas replied, his voice rougher than it used to be, but still warm with affection. And you know what? I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. Every struggle, every challenge, every moment of worry or fear, I'd do it all again for the chance to spend this life with you. Julia turned to look at him, really look at him, seeing past the silver hair and weathered skin to the young cowboy who had crouched beside her with coffee and water and kindness. Do you have any regrets? She asked. Any roads you wish you had taken instead? Lucas was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. No, he finally said. Not a single one. My only regret would be if I hadn't stopped that morning, if I had ridden past without seeing you. That would have been the greatest mistake of my life. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch, their home, their life. Inside, They could hear the soft murmur of voices as family members talked late into the night, sharing stories and memories. Outside, the horses moved peacefully in the pasture, and the stars wheeled slowly overhead in patterns that had been old when they were young. "Whatever comes next," Julia said softly. "However many years we have left, I want you to know that you made my life extraordinary. You took a broken, desperate woman and showed her what it meant to truly be loved. You gave me a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me everything." Lucas lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You gave me just as much. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting, to put down roots and grow. You trusted me with your heart and your son and your future, and I've tried every day to be worthy of that trust." "You've been more than worthy," Julia assured him. "You've been everything I needed and so much more than I knew to ask for." As the night deepened and the air grew cool, they finally went inside, climbing the stairs to their bedroom with the practiced ease of people who had walked this path together for 50 years. They lay down in the bed they had shared for half a century, and Lucas pulled Julia close, her head resting on his shoulder the way it had thousands of nights before. "I love you," he murmured into the darkness. "I love you too," Julia replied. "Today, tomorrow, and whatever comes after, always and forever." They drifted off to sleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, two lives so completely intertwined that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Outside, the ranch they had built continued its quiet nighttime rhythms, a testament to their love and labor. Inside, their family slept peacefully, carried by the foundation of love and commitment that Lucas and Julia had established all those years ago beside railroad tracks in the New Mexico desert. The sun would rise tomorrow on the ranch, as it had for 50 years, bringing new challenges and new joys. But whatever came, the Emmett family would face it together, sustained by the legacy of two people who had proven that love could bloom even in the harshest conditions, that second chances were real, and that sometimes the best things in life begin with the simplest acts of kindness. And somewhere, perhaps in the whisper of wind through the grass or the distant call of a train whistle, the story continued to echo. The story of a pregnant woman who slept beside railroad tracks until a cowboy woke her with coffee and a name, and in